Hey, everybody, we'll get started in a couple minutes. Probably have light attendance this time.
Hello.
Hey, Jeremy, how are you?
Not bad. How about you?
I'm doing okay.
Awesome.
How's everybody else doing? Excellent.
Just dandy.
Good. Okay. Well, we'll get started here in a minute. Guess it's a couple past already. All right, Laura, last time I looked, I think the agenda was empty except you were going to put something on there.
Yeah, I am on there. I'll share my screen. I can get started
okay.
now. Okay, so hopefully you all can see my screen right now. I wanted to just touch base on the cluster ID KEP that there's a PR for. And in particular, take a second just to briefly reintroduce it for anybody, but most importantly, bring up the outstanding questions that are on the PR. I kind of consolidated all the comments into, I think, 4 main questions that maybe I can just, check if there's any other discussion with the people who are here today about. And then I would love to determine if we can merge this PR with provisional status and then figure out what the next round of moving it to implementable is, either and what timeline we can do that on. So that's kind of the purpose. So just to remind, with my cute little clusters down here, but the goal of the cluster ID KEP is to define a standard for how clusters in a multi-cluster environment should refer to each other. And my understanding is that the goal here is to make it useful or strict enough to unblock some known use cases. And some of those have been, which is detailed in the KEP 2, multi-cluster, identifying clusters that are in a multi-cluster setup in logs, like for debugging purposes, to be able to disambiguate pods in a multi-cluster headless service, maybe put some cluster aware DNS names on them, track when new clusters have joined the environment, which is happening to teal and orange right now. So this is my understanding of why we're doing this and what sort of like minimal viable KEP here should achieve. So on the pull request, this is kind of what I thought the outstanding questions are. So there seemed to be some concern, particularly about how to mitigate people's existing implementation. So if people are already using multi-cluster setups that they home rolled, they have some idea of what a cluster ID might be in the wild. If they don't follow the standard that we're laying out now, like how do we make room for that? There's some discussion about how long does a cluster ID really need to be immutable and unique, and within what boundary. So is that like in the cluster set? Is that across, the whole CRD, and who or what is in charge of enforcing that? So I think part of this might have been about some loose language maybe in the pros, but we can talk about it directly. There was one sort of discussion point about whether clusters can be members of multiple cluster sets. And if so, how does this immutability uniqueness thing about cluster ID that we're trying to set up here in this standard hold in that case? And how are we going to pick a real name for cluster claim, because people don't like it? So those are the things. I kind of have one slide for each, and I'm going to pause a little bit and to see if anybody has any, thoughts about each one individually as I go. So for the first one, how do we mitigate people's existing implementations of cluster ID in the wild that may not follow this standard? It seemed that there were kind of 2 thoughts.
I'm still on the title slide.
Oh no. How did that happen?
Are you sharing maybe wrong window?
Yes. How embarrassing. Okay.
Oh, it may not share the presentation.
Yeah, when I popped out the presentation, all my jokes Did it work?
Well,
I thought
I
it
had
was
looked at the
me.
slide deck before, so when you said, orange
Okay,
and
good.
teal are
You-
doing that, I
you
got
got
it, but
this.
yeah.
Okay, we're going full
I
desktop
thought it was
because
me. I just went and reloaded.
I
I
cleaned
did too.
my desktop in case of emergency, so you didn't see anything. Oops, not that button. So you didn't see anything embarrassing, so that's fine. Okay, how about, do you see a second page now?
Lovely. Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay, hopefully you got this part, that this is what I want us to do. Here are my cute clusters that you missed before. Here is the overall questions, and then moving right along to where we left off. This is kind of the first question, so I kind of want to open for anybody to discuss here. How do we mitigate people's existing implementations of cluster ID in the wild that may not follow this standard? So this is what I kind of gathered from the conversation. Possibly we could explicitly state in this KEP that implementations not following the standard are not cluster claims and therefore can't benefit from any of the, from the implications of whatever strictness that we can apply as the standard develops over time, and or provide some migration information or recommendations, maybe in response even directly to some of the more well-known alternate implementations that this standard would be a deviation from. I don't personally have a lot of understanding of what the other kinds are, but happy to work with people on that. I guess I kind of want to hear if this is something we think we need to spend, like how much we should put in at this point, how much room we should really make for other existing implementations versus kind of focus on trying to get people to migrate, or maybe just explicitly stating that, if you're not doing this standard, then you're not this thing that the standard says this standard is. You know what I'm saying?
So are
Do
the
we
other
have-
implementations really one-offs? Like, someone's just done a home role and it's just one place, or is there any of the other implementations in the wild that are used over multiple organizations, for example?
Good question. I don't know. Does anybody else know?
I think it's mostly one-offs. Like people are, I mean, every multi-cluster anything has some way to identify clusters, but I don't know that we've really come up with any consistent model yet as a community that's in use. I think honestly, if we had, we'd probably just jump on that to some degree. I know there's been some questions about how cluster API could fit into this, and that aside, I don't know that that's really solved it either. My high level take is that, like, if we've kind of set out to define the bare minimum API that could be useful for building multi-cluster things on top of. So with that, if it really is the bare minimum useful API, then I think migration should be relatively easy. And by the same token, like I kind of like the idea of saying, like, anyone who's building on this API, like, you have to meet this API to be able to be cluster claim compatible, or whatever name we end up going with. And if you don't, then, like, multi-cluster services may not work correctly, that kind of thing. But to make that viable, I think we have to really focus on coming up with that bare minimum useful API.
I definitely think we should explicitly state that like the verbiage that is there is good. I think we're effectively saying that, like, we're also deciding that it's not a goal that we have cluster claims be backward compatible with any existing implementation of anything anywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to pick on what you just said, multi-cluster services are a semantic and an API, not an implementation. So any one implementation of multi-cluster service might or might not work without cluster claims. If you have a completely bespoke multi-cluster solution, say, for example, you built your one-off corporate version of this, and you want to start conforming to multi-cluster services, you can do that. Go nuts, right? If you want to take a community-derived implementation, you might need the cluster claims. But if you're using your own implementation, there's nothing stopping you from ignoring the cluster claim, right?
Yeah, I get that that's the general sense. And I think maybe what could potentially address the comments about it is a more explicit, basically what you just said on the KEP though.
Yeah,
I think that makes sense.
What we're like, this is a paving stone on a road towards more implementation consistency, but nobody is required to consume this.
Right.
Tim,
But I
I
guess-
hope that one day you're able to get out from the bottom of that very enormous water cooler bottle that I think you're at the bottom of.
You do sound very far away.
But I guess that
I guess he's
yeah, it's way better.
Oh,
Yes.
wow.
Sorry. Zoom
Ooh,
decided
climbed
to
out.
choose. Zoom decided to choose my built-in microphone instead of the fancy schmancy microphone sitting in front of me. Thanks, Zoom.
wrong choice, Zoom.
I do think, though, you know, we should also consider that part of it, like a corollary, I guess, is that as new things start building on cluster claims, you kind of do need to be compatible, right? Like you could opt out of cluster claims, but you're going to be opting out of more of the multi-cluster ecosystem.
Yeah, that's reasonable, but that's forwards looking, which is
Right.
fair, right? To
Yeah.
say retroactively you have to conform to this API that didn't exist at the time you were designed, obviously doesn't fly, but that's fine. It's just that we're going to build more stuff on top of this, and we suggest that you come along for the ride.
Yep.
All right.
I think this actually feeds nicely into the next question too, some of the things around that.
Yeah. I think just to close this one out, I think I can put a little bit more prose on this point, that this is the basis for more improvements in the multi-cluster API ecosystem. If you have an existing implementation, you know, you may not follow this standard, and then you wouldn't necessarily be considered a cluster claim under this specific standard, and that's fine. But we'll still be building on this basically, and then it will just be explicit, is what I'm getting from this conversation. So that's the plan there. Moving along, how long does a cluster ID need to be immutable and unique, and within what boundary? And what is in charge of enforcing that? So I picked up from the comments that we seem to be generally coalescing around as long as the cluster is in the cluster set. So its single cluster ID needs to be immutable and unique within that cluster set for as long as the cluster is in that given cluster set. And one of the sort of cases out of this would be that if you unregister and then re-register that same cluster, unregistering would involve deleting the cluster claim. But when you re-register, you would add a new one and potentially could have the same ID as it did before, possibly.
Does it have to be deleted?
That is in the KEP right now, that the cluster claim has to be deleted. So I guess that's an open point if that is a concern.
Well, I think there was a
cluster
distinction.
claims go away, or do they have a status so that if they haven't been heard from a while, you can kind of, I don't know, clean up, garbage collection?
Well, I think so. The cluster claim would be local to the cluster, right? Like this is within a cluster. So I think maybe an implementation could build. That's a good question. We should discuss what happens if like you lose connection to a registry or whatever's managing your membership. But I think one of the things is deleting we had a couple cluster claims enumerated, right? We had the cluster set ID and the cluster ID. I think deleting the cluster set ID when removing from a cluster set makes sense. I don't know that we necessarily want to make any assumptions around what happens to the cluster ID. Like there's no reason that couldn't live on. I just don't think we can mandate that it lives on.
That was the question I wanted to ask was, do we see cluster claims as intrinsic to a cluster or intrinsic to a cluster set or some of both?
Yeah, and I think some of both, right? Like the cluster ID is intrinsic to a cluster. I mean, in a perfect world, we could have really nice human readable cluster IDs that get created at the birth of the cluster and live as long as the cluster does. Obviously, that's not the world we actually live in. So I think there's a bunch of different implementations. I think the only thing we can mandate is that the cluster ID exists at least as long as a cluster is a member in a cluster set. And then we want to leave room for like globally unique in time and space IDs if some implementation does that. But that's for the cluster ID. I think for the cluster set ID, that is tightly coupled with membership in a cluster set. And it would be strange if it lived beyond, because then someone who thinks that the cluster is in a cluster set might take some action. So that could be a useful tool for detecting whether or not a cluster belongs to a cluster set within some margin of time for reconciliation.
So would it be useful within the KEP to just denote which well-known names we think are intrinsic to the cluster and which names are intrinsic to the set? Like, yeah. to touch on the cluster API topic, right? We could make a recommendation that when you use cluster API to install a cluster, that it creates a cluster ID claim and it puts it into the cluster and it never ever touches it again, right?
Right.
And if a user decides to change their cluster ID midstream, like who knows what will break downstream because we've told them not to do that.
Yep. Exactly.
Yep. Do we see cluster IDs being generated unique, but how are they going to be repeatable, right? So if I add a cluster to add to a cluster, set an instance to a cluster, and it comes up with a cluster ID that's unique, and then I unregister it and re-register it again, and find it gets a new cluster ID, but does it get a new unique cluster ID? I mean, are we going to get repeats? Do we overlaps? If I register one cluster and then delete it and then register another cluster, could it reuse an ID?
Yeah, I think we have to allow that. I mean, in a perfect world, I don't think we would. I think unique and non-repeatable is better. But because there's so many different implementations, and like, I don't know that that's a constraint we can mandate. We can certainly say unique during the lifetime within a cluster set. But beyond that, I think it's a should, not a must.
So it's not like we're going to be generating UUIDs every time.
Exactly, because basically that mandates a UUID, which means that if you ever want to use this in a human readable context, it gets really gross.
Unless you have UUIDs and essentially aliases, right, where you map, or you're using labels, right? You could use a UUID for the ID, makes it unique, and then you use labels, associate labels with the cluster IDs, if you will, and therefore you're now associating actions with a cluster member based on labels rather than anything else. That's very Kubernetes-esque, I would think.
So
yeah,
we're now
go ahead.
We're circling back to the original cluster ID quagmire, right? Which was exactly this, like, how prescriptive do we need to be? What about people who are importing old clusters? What about people who don't want to use UUIDs? What about human readable cases? I personally I think what we should do is not dictate, but strongly recommend that your cluster ID resource is effectively intrinsic to your cluster. Every cluster should have one, whether they're in a set or not. And if you don't have a good reason not to do this, what you should do is just take the UID off of the kube system namespace and use that UID. Because that is the only thing that a Kubernetes cluster has that is guaranteed not to be deleted, that has a unique ID attached to it. Now, every cluster,
compatible.
And it's backwards compatible. You can retrofit it onto any existing cluster. How we use that for a cluster set then becomes another layer of conversation.
Right. And if I could really simplify, I think the goals here, it's that we want a cluster ID claim intrinsic to the cluster that is guaranteed at least within a cluster set, but maybe beyond, preferably beyond, that can be used as basically a key and a map to look up clusters. That's kind of the real goal. So an implementation has a nice way to reference clusters in a cluster set. And then the cluster set ID within a cluster would be related to membership in a cluster set, and that would be a nice, easy way to identify which cluster set the cluster belongs to. And those are kind of like the two high-level things in my mind that we really want to accomplish here.
So I think that the semantics that you've just described Jeremy, they make sense to me. The other bullet on this slide is like, where do you enforce those things, right? So like, as an example, like, would it be productive to just think through a couple like failure modes of if you have a value, say that your cluster ID changes while you're inside a cluster set, what happens? What should enforce the uniqueness constraint there? And maybe since multi-cluster services are a good example because they're relatively real, what would we expect to happen if you have a multi-cluster service deployed on 3 clusters and cluster A's cluster ID claim changes?
Right.
Or you have a malicious cluster, someone trying to break in and trying to replicate a cluster ID.
Right. So so I think those probably could use some spelling out on the KEP, but in general, I would say that if that was allowed to change, things would break. I don't know how, but like if we say things shouldn't break, if you change those, then you need to, what Tim said. It's a MAC address. Things will go really funky if that changes, because we're using it to reference each cluster, and like, I guess new services that get created might use the new ID/address in their headless service names. Old services may not until maybe forever, or maybe until some future reconciliation. So I mean, maybe there needs to be an admission controller that prevents mutating. Of course, you could always delete and recreate, as long as we.
Yeah.
So, and that's an issue we have throughout Kubernetes too. Like, there's tons of immutable things that you can change by delete and recreate. So
I used to be a big proponent of trying to enforce immutability and really draconian rules, and every time I do that, I end up regretting it, because at some point it becomes the thing between me and my goal.
Right.
So or users find a way around it, and then I have no way of dealing with it. So I think we're better off here saying, this is what we strongly urge people to do. Use a UUID. In fact, use the Cube system UUID. That way you're guaranteed to be compatible with everybody else, and don't ever change it. If you change it, it might be cached, it might be used in other systems. It is the primary key for your cluster. If you change your own primary key, it's broken and you get to keep both halves.
Yeah, and I think, since to remember that Laura's goal for today is to get the KEP to provisional status, I think don't do it wrong is a very reasonable principle at that level of maturity.
Well, and we can make that a little firmer and say that cluster claims in general are a highly, like, write access to cluster claims. Everyone should be able to read them, but write access is a highly privileged activity that should be reserved for admins who won't break things. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yep.
Because, if I'm an admin, I can break anything in my cluster anyway. So, so don't break this if you're an admin, and if you're not an admin, you shouldn't be able to touch it anyway.
Okay. There's a question about cross certs to authenticate, and Jeremy said maybe in the future. In particular, I took out the verification related stuff from this KEP so that we could save it for another day. So I'm gonna skip over that one for now.
Yeah, just a little TLDR. I think it's captured in the doc, but had a chat with some folks from SIG Auth, and basically we don't have a good thing to verify against that's universal. So we'd be signing, like anyone who could write a cluster claim would probably be able to force a signature. So, you know, that verification probably needs to be something out of band.
Or it needs some other factor that isn't part of the resource being signed, right?
Right, right. And so we need, basically, we should revisit in the future was the when we have specific use cases and that was kind of the feedback.
Okay, cool. Is there any other points about this implication that this is enforced? What I got out of the conversation just now was that there are some cases that we could, you know, specify, like what happens when a cluster joins maliciously as another one, or what happens when a cluster changes its ID in the middle of its life. And it sounded like delete and recreate as the pressure valve for being able to mutate is better than a enforced admission controller idea, and that we would recommend for admins basically what they should do, and which includes not changing its ID midlife,
Right.
and leave it up to them to break their own clusters if they want.
We can always come back and revisit this, right? We're going to go
Yeah.
through a life cycle
Yeah.
here.
Totally.
I think the big thing about immutability and the statement that we make there is really telling anyone who's dependent on this that they don't need a watch and that they don't need to react to changes. And if they see a new cluster ID, they can treat it as a new cluster, which, you know, has a bunch of implications on implementations and what they can do.
Right. Okay. So I've got a couple notes of some more shoulds and musts that could go in from this conversation. So I will move along. Can clusters be members of multiple cluster sets? And if so, what happens to our special words here in that case? And there seemed to be basically a, oh no, sounds very complicated kind of feeling, if I understood properly. And then let's discuss. Do you think that's a discussion for right now, for table it for later?
My gut feeling, just my own subjective personal feeling, is that I don't think we should make it impossible to do that, because I can easily imagine like a multi-hub setup in a sufficiently large organization where like maybe there's one hub that is about like cluster level configuration management and like cluster level services, and a completely different hub for user applications. I think it would not pay us back to write that off.
I kind of, well, so I can see the use cases, but I'm just practically trying to think, like, we've created concepts like namespace sameness. And if a cluster belongs to two cluster sets, that seems like it actually links the namespace sameness spaces, and like we're kind of picking and choosing cluster set behaviors that are spread across, but like namespace sameness would then seem to have to hold across both cluster sets if there's any overlapping clusters. So I wonder if instead we shouldn't try to maybe you can only belong to one cluster set, but we come up with like a sub cluster set concept, and you know, this is a whole separate conversation.
You're creating hierarchical namespaces, right? Because a cluster set really is just another namespace.
Exactly. And that might be safer, because at least then we can still make statements about the cluster set, like namespace sameness. So in all the namespaces within your hierarchical cluster sets, namespace sameness would still hold, but maybe other things don't have to. Maybe like multi-cluster services could be applied to sub-cluster sets or something. I'm just riffing right now without having put a lot of thought into this, but
I just think you're going to have to build into each individual cluster, though, that hierarchical naming thing, so that I can have this, you know, a namespace foo in two different cluster sets, and yet they're unique, right? So now a namespace is unique per cluster set, not unique per, I don't know, per cluster.
So one way to address this is just to say that, like, if you think that you need to be in two different cluster sets, that you're really just describing a cluster set with a bigger boundary than you thought. And
Yes,
That's how I feel
exactly.
about it. That you
And-
actually just made your cluster set bigger.
right, and that within a cluster set, there's like namespace sameness applies, but there's no principle that like any particular individual has permission to write into every namespace, right? So there will naturally be varying levels of privilege within what you can do on any particular cluster in the set that still respect namespace sameness.
Right.
Are they trying to accomplish kind of a multi-tenant? Again, I'm just trying to understand the use case. Are you trying to do kind of a multi-tenant aspect here by saying I'm going to be part of the 2 different cluster sets? What are you trying to accomplish, I guess? Still,
I don't think
struggling a
I
little
don't
with
think
the
there's a
use
real
case.
example to figure
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah. The things I've heard are like, well, what if I want to expose some services from one cluster set to another cluster set? And I think Tim just mentioned this too. Like explicit collaboration between cluster sets is probably something we want to talk about, but separately. Like that feels more like ingress to a cluster set,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
and then maybe we can do better than that. Maybe we can have something that's a little more like a little friendly because we know that everybody's Kubernetes, but we should probably yeah, we could call it federation. But I think that's like a separate topic that we should address, but I kind of agree that like as soon as a cluster belongs to multiple cluster sets, you really just kind of made your cluster set bigger. And if you don't look at it that way and you actually try to keep them separate, you're probably in for a world of pain trying to figure out like, what is this name? Like, what are the invisible transitive impacts across the cluster set boundary?
Yeah.
So I apologize for approaching this from a networking point of view, but that is my primary SIG. The way I think of a cluster set is sort of a mesh. And I did a talk at KubeCon in San Diego last year about how Kubernetes is kind of already a mesh. Multi-cluster services extends the mesh beyond one cluster to multiple clusters. I think it fits really well at the cluster set concept. And within the larger mesh world, there is this concept of mesh federation, which is an unfortunate choice of words, but that's what it is. And I think that's the place where you join different cluster sets. And then within the set, I agree with everything everybody else was saying. You're extending your mesh, you're extending your set.
Right. My model is like peered networks, like a cluster set belonging to two networks, or a cluster belonging to 2 cluster sets is peering between 2 networks. What happens? And look at like IP ranges as namespaces. What happens if both of those networks use the same IP range? How does that cluster know who to talk to? And yeah, super complicated. So
Okay, so it sounds like there's a potential collaboration, cluster set collaboration talk in the future, but skip it for now, is what I'm getting.
I would be happy to come back and revisit this if somebody brings real concrete use cases. I think
Right.
for now, the simplifying assumption is one.
Okay.
Right.
Cool, I can run with that. And now for the layup, how are we going to pick a real name for cluster claim? Sounds like we do polls here, so I can make a poll. And these are the ideas that I have seen eavesdropped on. If anybody wants to throw something else in the hat, I assume I can also put a little other text box so we can accumulate more from people who aren't on the PR or aren't here in this call.
Can I get a better definition of what this term is meant to reference?
Yes, this is supposed to reference the structure of these, let's see, I put it in here, of these 2 claims. It's a little crowded in here now, but they're basically combinations of name and value for either the cluster ID or the cluster set membership. And Sorry, I'm trying to pull up the definition of them, but now I'm lost. On my
I
own
think
screen.
like kind of my summary would be like a fact about the cluster that is probably related to identity, but I don't know that that necessarily will always be true, but some kind of global fact about the cluster.
Yeah, and right now the facts of interest are what is this cluster's name and what cluster set is this cluster in right now are the two things that we're tracking, but assumedly it could be more things.
And
I think
those
like
are
someone
two
commented
different
region at
facts
some
or two.
point.
Are
Yeah, those are two different
or-
facts.
How about thing about cluster?
Cluster thing.
Stuff about this cluster.
Because claim brings me back to like persistent volumes claims. So when I say a claim, I'm thinking that relationship.
Yeah, that's why we should not use claim.
Right. And we also with the claim, I think we originally had validation in there, which we decided to scrap. I think it made more sense when it was like a verifiable claim, but now it's just like maybe it's a key value.
All right, cluster property thingy, cluster attrib, these are all great.
I think
Really
we
like
should
thingy.
probably just have a little poll.
Yeah. I just wanted to peel off any more brainstorming that might be at hand, but I will definitely send the poll and put a free form text box too if there's any other thoughts, I guess.
Yeah, so one thing that Josh Burkus has done in the past, in the last 6 months or so, I think we've run a couple of these things, is we have like a public comment or publicly writable spreadsheet where we gathered names and then binned the ones that were non-starters and then ran a poll.
Okay.
Yep.
So there's a spreadsheet step first.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we could like share out a spreadsheet today or something, and then
I can arrange the spreadsheet step first.
Yeah.
For sure.
And then we'll run a poll. Maybe in the new year we'll go through and pull out all the non-starters, and then we can run a poll. But I don't know that needs to block calling it provisional.
No way.
Speaking of, can we merge this as provisional? Maybe you all already know, but this was the definition of provisional. I'm new to Kubernetes governance, so I needed to read it. And
I think, oh, sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say what should be done before it can be merged as provisional.
I think if you incorporate the feedback from this meeting, I would personally feel comfortable merging it as provisional.
Okay, cool. Any other feelings, thoughts?
Facts, claims.
Facts, claims, perhaps.
Liberal use of the unresolved tag to cover areas where we have some open debate, and I think we should plow ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, including things like named. I think unresolved is a good. So a good thing to use. So any remaining questions, let's just make sure they're included.
Okay. Sounds good. I will make some updates. I will make a spreadsheet, and hopefully I caught everything. I'll let people comment again if not, but hopefully we can get it into the next phase is my goal.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Laura.
Cool. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Sorry you didn't get to see all my slides and heard me talk for 5 minutes.
It's okay. Tim, did you want to talk about your diagram?
I would be happy to if you think it's interesting.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
Let me share.
Generally, I like diagrams, and this is an especially good one.
Well, now you're just fluffing me up, Paul.
That's what I like to call a little diagram joke.
You guys got it?
I see.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So the discussion around what was it, Karmada, got me thinking. Like all I could see was the patterns, right? And we're using different words and we were arguing about different details. But I felt like I'd seen the pattern enough times before that it might be worthwhile to try to extract the framework from the details. So after the meeting, I guess 2 weeks ago, I sat down to sketch this out. And I've mutated the words a little bit over the last couple of weeks, but pretty much this is what I saw. I see this pattern if you look at the various GitOps products, they follow the same basic pattern. If you look at Karmata and Federation, they follow the same basic flow. And so maybe it's useful to talk through the stages of this. So I started with this idea of the user who talks to a source of truth. Now in GitOps world, that would be a Git repository, and they would make a pull request or something to their Git repository. In the Karmata point of view, that would be a K8s API server, or in the Federation point of view, that would be a Kubernetes API server that you load some YAML or some resource definition into. And if you squint, like this is the work API, and everything else just sort of fits into the same pattern. So we load some payload into the source of truth. Then there's some target selection heuristic, whether that's label selectors on a set of clusters in some look-aside registry, or whether it's some other database query. Like, it doesn't really matter. The target selection mechanism is related to, like, none of these things are independently mutable. They're part of a stack, right? And so there's some way of saying, I want this raw payload and I want it to apply to these clusters. And you need a cluster registry to know which clusters are eligible for that, right? So abstractly, the cluster set is our cluster, is the grouping of clusters. It's going to be stored somewhere. And I expect over the next year that we'll see some interesting implementations of these ideas. Now that you've selected which clusters this payload is going to go to, there's going to be a 0 or more specializations that you apply per cluster, right? So I know some people use templates, like I've seen people doing Jinja processing. We've seen people doing Helm. We've seen people doing Customize. We've seen the Karmata stuff had some specifics, right? I forget exactly the details of it, but we've seen a dozen different ways of templatizing and expanding specializations. Now that you've specialized and you've got a mechanism, or sorry, you've got a payload that you want to deliver to each cluster, there's a delivery system, right? And one of the big things that in the Karmata docs was discussion of push versus pull. They were very keen on the idea that the member cluster contacts some service and pulls updates, and other systems rely on push, right? And I know there are these systems out there that assume that they can talk to every cluster in the set, and they're going to go out and push. The difference doesn't really matter from an abstract point of view. And in fact, there may be policies applied here, right? Like who's doing it, or what time of day it is, or the rate limit for how fast you can push to different clusters. But at the end of the day, this payload runs through this pipeline, and it gets delivered out to the individual member clusters. I was hoping, now we can quibble over the words, I was hoping that if we agree that this is the basic framework or something like this, then whenever we look at a new example of an API, we can say, well, this is the specialization phase, and this is the delivery phase, and these are the details. And maybe just simplify some of the conversations.
I think one of the other things that comes out of this diagram too is it looks like we actually have maybe some separate phases that can be built independently, right? So maybe there's like an all-up implementation that handles everything from the source of truth all the way down to payload delivery, but maybe, target selection can be a plugin, payload specialization can be a plugin, or something like, there are other ways. I think framing it this way gives us other ways to look at the problem.
Yeah, so, and possibly, but also like giving words to the different phases of this this life. I'm trying to find the right word. It's not a life cycle. It's a stack.
Right.
It's a pipeline at some level.
Yeah, it is kind of a pipeline. But like, to get really concrete with it, like the payload could in fact be the raw YAML plus a bunch of specializations, like a customize directory, right? And so the pink and the blue level are kind of merged, but abstractly they are different things, right? Likewise, the payload delivery just because the source of truth is Git doesn't mean that it's always going to be pulled or pushed. I could have an active agent who gets webhooks from GitHub and pushes down to member clusters, or I could have an agent in each member cluster polling GitHub directly, right? And so I liked the stages kept independent. Sorry, I'm talking a lot.
So one other variable that I think is present in this chart that I don't know that there's a good way to do it, but like the payload itself has many different forms, and the best like thing that I can draw through that space currently is like there's a pattern of I'm distributing individual resources, or I'm distributing a package, right? So like a subscription type thing, or Helm chart, or name your package format here is a different kind of payload from you've got individual resources you're distributing. And I don't know that it necessarily needs to be represented in this diagram, but it's like in the neighborhood as a related concept that seems to divide like the space that we've seen in the SIG recently.
Sure, that's an interesting point, right? Because if the payload is a Helm chart, the thing that I'm actually pushing out to the clusters may not be the Helm chart. It may actually be the expanded form of all those resources. Is that where you're going?
Well, I think what you said is true, but more that like it seems to be like a dimension that characterizes part of the problem space is like, KubeFed 1 and 2 and the Karmata thing are really not about distributing packages. They're about distributing individual resources, versus like if I'm distributing a Helm chart, and like Michael Elder, who was here last week, was talking with Kevin, who was presenting on Karmata about their subscription thing that like one of their that is essentially around distributing packages. So like you can make a subscription to a Helm chart. I'm just making the observation that like it seems to be one of the axes that people like view the problem space in. Like they tend to either be thinking individual resources or packages.
Right.
So I don't know if it needs representation here, but I just thought I would mention it as something that like seems like it's another variable.
That's an interesting distinction. I'm not sure what I think about that. In some sense, they're both raw payloads, and you could hand wave and say, well, the specialization is the part where it takes a package and expands it. Or it I could imagine maybe breaking or inserting a layer somewhere that was sort of the denormalization step.
I think depending on what scheme your payload delivery step has, that it might vary. Like I could see payload delivery like distributing a resource that says install this chart, right? Like so I
agree. That's the part that I'm actually struggling a little bit with, right? Assume my source of truth is Git, I could just check in a chart or even just a reference to a chart, right?
Mm-hmm.
And say, well, I expect the foobar chart to be on all of my clusters. And the expansion of the foobar chart could happen all the way down in the member cluster, right? Or it could happen at the specialization, or it could happen at it could happen at any one of these stages.
Mm-hmm.
But I could just as easily have the user say, well, I want to apply this chart, so go ahead and expand it to its fully denormalized form, and then check that in, and then have the individual things pushed out, and the net result will be the same.
Yeah.
But the the concept is different at what level you want to manage it. Likewise, I could even see source of truth be broken into two parts, where the user checks in the chart, an automated system expands it into another repository, and then that does specialization. So I wonder how specific we want to get here.
Well,
I think
yeah, the issue is
expansion
if you
conversion-
expanded it to member cluster, right, you got to have consistent expansion, right?
Right.
Or are there variables per cluster member that you're going to be specialized, which says you're back to
Well-
where you do the templates or the customized layer.
But you could have those variables that either like before or after expansion, or you could even have multiple phases of expansion. Like, it seems less likely, but you could have some source get expanded at one phase, like at delivery, and then member clusters do some additional expansion. I guess, like, I think getting hung up on payload as like what we're used to, which is like YAML, it makes this a little more difficult. To me, that seems kind of like a separate thing that may or may not be part of a system.
I think what I'm trying to say is maybe there can be a little call out comment that like payload can have many forms.
Right.
It might be,
and it may change
it
forms
might be
at
something,
each
it might
step.
be charts, it might be your thing here.
Right.
And probably what
Okay.
matters the most about it is that like it's the part that you expose to the user is what matters the most about it. It matters a lot less like how it's transformed after that. But I guess the only thing to, since like you noted on here, it might, source of truth might be Git repository, might be Kubernetes API, just maybe another little call out that's like payload can have many forms too.
Okay, that's a great feedback, and that one's easy to integrate. I'm still going to think a little bit about whether it's worth denoting like processing steps, like perhaps there's a processor between the user and the source of truth, and perhaps there's a processor between the source of truth and the payload delivery somewhere, and perhaps there's a processor at the member cluster, and any one or all of those could be no-op.
Well, maybe every arrow is a processor or no-op.
We're
Like,
going to get
that's-
into a lot of ambiguity
yeah.
here, so much so that it's not going to provide value.
Yeah.
Is it better to be prescriptive and say, yeah, we're going to cut off some limit, we're going to limit this to this is how it's going to happen, but then everybody's going to have a very consistent model of what's going to happen. The more, could be processed here, could expand here, the ambiguity is going to kill us, I would think.
Yeah, I'm trying to be descriptive, not prescriptive here. I was trying to attach general terms to things that people are already doing, right? But I have my own feelings about how things should be done, but I know that's not how people are always doing it.
That maybe just a top level, like there may be a processor somewhere in here that changes the form of the payload is enough. There may or may not.
Okay.
Because I think like it's good to specify that there is a processor, but in terms of the actual flow, I don't really think it matters. Like if my payload gets transformed slightly but still represents the same data at each phase, that's fine, right? Like that, I don't think that changes this model at all.
Yeah. Here's a question that I was thinking about last night. Where should this thing live so that it's accessible?
What, the diagram?
Yeah.
I just sort of wrote it for the purpose of discussion. I hadn't really thought about publishing it more broadly. I don't know.
Something to think about.
Unfortunately, there's no really good like collaborative image formats that are easily diffable. I mean, I could turn it into ASCII art and we could check it in as a markdown file.
I mean, even just making it discoverable though, like linking to it from like the same place we put namespace sameness might be cool, so that people can at least find it, right?
I would be happy to render this and check it in somewhere. I just feel like that makes it not very amenable to changes over time. Let me think about how to do that. I was sort of joking about ASCII art, but maybe I'm not actually joking.
I added this comment too in the chat. Is there a parallel reverse diagram, if you will, or to show synchronization of data backup from the clusters and how that gets back to the source of truth or is reflected in the source of truth, whether that's resources that were created directly against a member cluster, or resources that existed on a cluster when it becomes a member?
So Paul had a comment that was specifically about garbage collection, but I think it's really just about reconciliation in general, which is the payload delivery mechanism really owns the responsibility for deciding whether there's actually anything to do here or not, right? So if the resource already exists and it's in the form that it wants to be, then the payload delivery is effectively no op, right? There's an open question of, what happens if you find a resource that you're supposed to be managing and it's different from the way I'm supposed to be managing it. In general, this is the don't touch things at multiple layers of the stack problem. I don't know what I should say about it here because it's an opinionated position that I think implementations will want to choose. Some will warn and some will just blast.
Yeah, I think I don't think that question has to have a neat answer right now. Like, I think the primary value of this picture is that it puts names on things that, like, we've all talked about without naming them. And I do think this captures a lot of commonalities in different, like, fairly different approaches. So I feel like it's just a solid diagram, and it's good for being a solid diagram.
I agree with that.
Doesn't need to be anything more.
I agree with that. I mean, I could use this diagram and actually say what you've defined here is Helm.
Yes. Yes, a user running Helm fits this diagram.
Yep.
Right. The user has chosen which cluster. The Helm repo is the source of truth. The user has chosen which target. They run Helm and it specializes and it is pushed out into the clusters.
Yep.
Right. Okay, I got some feedback. I will work on this diagram and I will think about how to commit it. I know Bowie says save as an SVG, and SVGs are diffl, but kind of only barely.
Yeah, in my experience, SVG diffs look like JPEG diffs. You're not going to read them either way. So,
yeah.
But like,
well, I mean, GitHub will render them so you can actually look at the images, but unless what changed is obvious, it's very difficult to review.
Right. Yeah. Like you can see them side by side, but nothing highlighted.
GraphViz is actually not a terrible idea.
Yeah.
I don't know what good rendering tools there are for GraphViz. I don't use it much. I'll look into what options could be here.
Waiting for someone to say PostScript. Okay.
Silence.
So final order of business. Should there be any more business in this year?
I've kind of assumed, based on holiday schedules, everything, it might make sense to, reconvene in January, early January. I don't know what everybody else thinks.
I am certainly not going to be doing any more work this year, so I'm in favor of being done. But I would never stop a plucky group of open source collaborators that wanted to collaborate.
I'm personally going to use the tail end of this year to try to wrap up docs and KEPs. So I'm happy to have no more meetings and just try to get whatever KEPs are outstanding in.
Cool.
If everybody did the same, more of our KEPs would get merged.
The motion is adopted.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a safe, and joyous New Year celebration, and we'll see you next year.
See you then.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. See ya.
Cheers.
Bye.